In this week's roundup of the news, President Trump announces that the US is definitely pulling out of the Paris Agreement on climate change, an announcement with less immediate importance than you might think. A new UK study says that a move to 100% organic farming would lead to an increase in greenhouse gas emissions, and the shockwaves continue to echo after the disastrous conclusion to Extinction Rebellion's latest campaign in London. My name's Mallen Baker. This is the Mallen Baker Show for Change. If you're newly subscribed to this channel, welcome. There has been a surge of new subscriptions this week, which is very gratifying to a relatively new channel trying to make its way. The tweet-sized introduction is that in these videos, I try to encourage you, the viewer, to see yourself as a change maker and to analyse the issues based on, as much as I can, in any case, on what the facts say, what the science says, and without fear nor favour. Our USP is pissing off ideologues at both extremes of the issues, and doing so with a smile, some research, and according to my critics, crazy eyes when I get really into a topic. Seriously, we've entered some deeply polarised times, and it may be that there's no one left in the middle arguing against all the crazy on each of the edges. I'm hopeful that's not the case, and if it is and I'm on my own, then so be it. In the old days, I would have wandered dazed and disoriented down the high street, randomly shouting and cursing at shadows. But in the modern era, we have YouTube. First up is the news that President Trump has announced that the US is pulling out of the Paris Agreement on climate change. Now, at this point, you may be slightly confused because you probably have a memory, getting faint now, but definitely there. Didn't that happen already? Well, we're hearing about it now because it was never so simple that the president could just decide in 2016 to leave the Paris Agreement and bam, it was done. There's a slightly extended process that has to be gone through. And we're now getting to the stage where the timetable permits the US to formally table its intention to withdraw. Once it does so, the process drags on slowly thereafter, only concluding 1 year later with the US finally definitely being out, assuming it doesn't change its mind, on November the 4th, 2020. President Trump announced the formal next stage in typical Trump fashion, surrounded by energy workers in hard hats applauding him. Because, of course, the whole positioning for all of this is that Trump is the fossil fuel president, standing up for the jobs of energy workers, not renewable energy workers, you understand, who he probably assumes, and probably with some justice, that many of them are vegans and would never vote for him in a million years. No, of course he means manly fossil fuel energy workers who wear hard hats. If you're tuned into the US presidential election cycle, you'll notice that that final date, November the 4th, is tantalisingly 1 day after the next presidential election. So if you deeply care about the US being in the Paris Agreement, you might be fantasising that Trump will lose the election and his successor will immediately save the day like Indiana Jones snatching his hat through the closing door of death. Nah, that's not going to happen. Because, of course, the new president doesn't get sworn in straight away anyway. And if you think that President Trump's going to lift a finger to change course on that because of what his successor would want, I think we all know that's not going to happen. But none of this is the slightest bit as important as people think, not in the short term. On the one hand, in spite of a president's stance, the US has reduced its emissions significantly, even though that progress may have run its course on the current evidence. Why? Well, although with his encouragement the oil and gas sectors are indeed booming, his campaign promise to restore coal to be a fuel of great importance has not worked out, simply because the economics are not there. The price of coal is now a lot more than the price of renewables and natural gas, and also because new coal-fired power stations are long-term investments and businesses are not stupid. They know that Trump's next term, assuming he wins a second one and manages to see it out, will almost certainly be followed by someone, of whichever party, who will be more pragmatic about what's going to happen to coal as a fuel in the relatively short term. And of course, it doesn't make much difference if the US has formally concluded its exit from Paris by the time his successor is sworn in, whether it's 2021 or 2025, they can still begin to introduce substantive policies to make better progress. It isn't the Paris Agreement that will reduce emissions. It's what governments and businesses and states actually do that will reduce emissions. And some of those businesses and states are carrying on. Elon Musk is not waiting for the Paris Agreement to shake up the energy mix, and you shouldn't either. I mean, in theory, the US government, even though it's announced its intention to leave, is formally bound by the provisions of the Paris Agreement until it actually does so in 2020. Well, do we think the US government has made one single decision differently as a result of that theoretical international legal commitment? I don't. And it's worth noting that if they had stayed in and done exactly what they've done in practice, wouldn't be so very different to what a number of important countries who are actually in the agreement have actually done. That doesn't make the agreement useless, as some argue, because it has built in the mechanisms to review and adjust as we go. But at the moment, in practice, the significance of the US withdrawal has been more symbolic than anything else. And it's perhaps given permission for more recalcitrant positions by certain other countries. The real question is whether at the next election, the position on climate change will be represented by a solid, practical position, or whether it will be represented by the extreme left version that at least some of the current Democratic candidates are currently espousing. If the latter, then given Trump's proven ability to set the agenda during these campaigns, it will be the gift to him of an eminently attackable platform, which may well help him to get elected, but even more importantly, may taint the popular view of what it means to support action on climate change, which may set us back even further. The Democratic candidates are currently facing off in the primaries. The danger is always that what plays well with the party base for primaries is increasingly the more radical leftism and intersectional identity politics. But that is not what plays well subsequently with the country at large. The key is disentangling what are the practical measures that actually make a substantial difference and that will help make people's lives better so that they'll actually support them. Because a lot of the symbolic issues beloved of the traditional environmentalists arguably fail that test. And the agenda promoted by the extreme groups like Extinction Rebellion definitely fail that test. For example, in the peer-reviewed journal Nature Communications, a paper was published this week that showed if the UK converted all of its agriculture to become organic, something that a number of environmentalists would advocate, it would lead to significantly higher greenhouse gas emissions per unit of food, simply because a lot more land would have to be used in order to produce the same quantity of food. Because organic farming would reduce yields overall by 40%, it would probably result in significantly more having to be sourced from abroad, which isn't the direction you want to be going in, as the world population continues to increase and world food production needs to be more efficient. Now, I don't want to give the impression that I am anti-organic in any way. Generally, I would aim to utilise organic principles in my own garden where I can. And there are certain types of food where organically produced can be tastier and more nutritious, and I'm a big fan of that. It's a valid premium product choice. But that's not the same question as to whether it's suitable as a nationwide agriculture policy. Now, like all of these things, it's not as simple as it sounds. Some foods, like chicken and egg production, has seriously higher emissions under an organic system, whereas others, including the much derided beef production, has improved emissions performance with organic. And there are other significant benefits with organic production that you don't want to completely ignore. Much more beneficial for soil maintenance, for instance, and for supporting farmland wildlife at a time when biodiversity is declining. But the basic message is that producing food at scale in a sustainable world is probably going to be a lot more intensive than the Greens would like to think, even though that then gives us other problems we have to solve, like soil erosion, which is a big issue. Of course, the people who are most committed to organics absolutely hated this research, because it's always our first instinct to hit back at the research when it comes up with an answer we don't like. So Rob Percival of the Soil Association said that the assumptions behind the survey were deeply flawed. The study assumes no change in diet, which is clearly untenable. Dietary change will benefit the public's health and free up land, making an organic scenario entirely feasible. Now, with respect, that's a whole different question. I don't think anyone can assume that such a major change in diet is going to be forthcoming so that it's going to compensate for such a major loss in land productivity. Lawrence Smith, one of the principal researchers, had interesting thoughts about a third way. He said this: if we could combine the best of organic with the best of non-organic, we could get very high efficiencies. For example, if organic farmers could use some non-organic fertilizers, that would greatly increase yields while still retaining some organic principles. He also thinks that organic standards should be revised to allow the use of gene-edited crops. Now that, of course, is exactly the sort of practical, pragmatic thinking that the purists would absolutely crucify you for. One of the remarkable things about the modern environmentalist movement is that on the one hand it swears that we're in the middle of an urgent climate crisis and we have to act now. And on the other, they don't for 2 seconds want to contemplate revisiting and challenging some of the previous assumptions of their own, even if the actual evidence suggests that we might need to address that very crisis. Now, these things need reviewing with clear criteria and a minimum of ideology. Speaking of ideological campaigners, let's cast a quick look back at Extinction Rebellion, who the last time we saw them had just committed to the spectacular blunder of provoking early morning commuters at Canning Town tube station. As the dust settled, we initially saw a mixed bunch of responses, with some attempts to justify what had been done, but ultimately the message emerged that this had been a mistake. It was not endorsed by the main group and lessons would be learned. This was what Extinction Rebellion's Rupert Reed had to say about it in a statement on his Facebook page. I deeply regret that the action on the tube went ahead this morning. XR Political Strategy Group, to which I belong, advised strongly and unanimously against it, as did the vast majority of the movement. This, of course, is a reference to the fact I mentioned last week that internal polling of XR members came out with a massive majority against the tube level action before it took place. So the story here is that it was just a rogue group, a negative consequence perhaps of that famed decentralized way of working. He went on, lessons must be learned so that never again can the actions of a tiny number of XR activists tarnish the entire movement. Once it was clear that this action was going ahead, XR should have disowned it yesterday. But we didn't, it seems, have a process for doing so. Now I'm curious about this. You'll note the dismissive XR activists brackets sick to suggest that these weren't real XR activists at all. But it's emerged that actually it's not that simple. For instance, a couple of the founders seem to have been directly involved, specifically this man, Robin Boardman-Pattison, who, if you remember from the first Extinction Rebellion fortnight, was the one who stormed out of a Sky TV interview. He seems to have been present in the support of the group. And he was also promoted in advance by this man, Stuart Basden, who was the author of an early blog post that first outlined how Extinction Rebellion was really about a left-wing revolution, not about climate change. The title of that blog post, Extinction Rebellion is not about the climate. So I don't think it's feeding massively unjustified conspiracy theories to ask the question, how can it have been just some random unrepresentative group, so unrepresentative you're going to put the XR into quotes, if it was led by people who have been at the heart of the movement so far? Now, this was confirmed by one of the commenters on my last video, who is active with Extinction Rebellion, who made this comment. The self-organizing protocol that would have stopped any communication or call out about this action due to every circle voting strongly against it was superseded by the old XR hierarchical power structure. The reason the action went ahead was because it was designed by one of the old founders, who used personal communication channels rather than the agreed point people structure to organize it. Or that's what I heard, and that makes sense with other first-hand information that I have. So If you add this to the fact that XR's highest profile founder, Roger Hallam, led a splinter group to fly drones at Heathrow, what you begin to see is a group really kind of at war with itself. I mean, I've mentioned here numerous times that the original founders are left-wing activists whose vision was that XR is more about overthrowing the state than it was purely about climate change as an issue. And I speculated that this might cause some issues down the line, with a big influx of people attracted to the movement who are primarily focused on that issue of climate change and who are not attracted particularly by that political angle. Add to that the chaos inherent to the leaderless model of this sort of campaign, and you kind of have an interesting recipe for conflict. And what we seem to be seeing is that indeed the original radical founders are refusing to be bound by processes that are dominated by the less radical elements, and so are finding ways to take action with or without the full group's approval. Add to that the devastating kickback you've seen against XR because of Roger Hallam and Gail Bradbrook's own massively overblown claims about the science, and you have to say that a lot of people are probably looking at those founders as, well, shall we say, a mixed blessing? Arguably, this is inevitable if the aims and the objectives of the founders aren't in line with the intuitively obviously intended aims of the bulk of the followers. And we'll see what happens from here. It could go one of several ways. One is that someone like Hallam, through a higher profile and his written work, could succeed in rising to informal leadership of the network and radicalising a significant percentage of the recent intake at the same time. Probably in that case, the movement would shrink as moderates distance themselves and the group then becomes more committed and hardcore radical. I think I doubt that will be the outcome, because I don't think Roger's style and persona is the sort that would drive that process. Alternatively, the group may simply eat itself. Internal dissension, the sort of power politics that thrives in structureless environments. And that would probably mean that it will become less and less effective in its own terms over the next coming years. And you can see some of this in action already, with various left-wing activists hammering the group for not fitting in with the full range of left preoccupations around things like intersectional group identity politics and being more overtly antagonistic to the police. Such left causes could push XR into a more and more fragmented mindset, pursuing all of the different issues and losing the original power of focus which it had on the climate change issue. The only other alternative I can see is that if new leadership rises up and establishes a degree of authority in line with what the bulk of non-leftists think the group should be. That might make the group a powerful force over the next few years. It would have to be around a revised mission focusing actually on climate change. But although I'm obviously a very long way from being an insider, I haven't seen any signs of any emergent new style leaders. In the meantime, XR reminded us of what it's like at its worst, when this week it did an action designed to argue for climate change to be better represented in education to our children. Now look, in principle I agree that education of an appropriate age should be taught the science behind climate change. But then my understanding is they already are. So then you have to look at what actually is being demanded here. These are the demands being made, according to XR, by concerned teachers within Extinction Rebellion. 1. We must be supported to tell and teach the truth of climate and ecological breakdown. Define truth. I mean, in geography or physics, you may learn about the climate processes and how they're being impacted. Climate and ecological breakdown is a polemical term, not a scientific one, that describes where we currently are. And I'm not sure. You could argue this either way, basically, in absence of more detail, as to what they think should be taught that isn't being taught. But then we go on. 2. We must teach, brackets, and learn, why net zero emissions by 2025, as well as a complete halt to biodiversity loss, is both necessary and achievable. Okay. So this is just taking the 3 core demands of Extinction Rebellion and turning them into lessons for kiddies. The suggestion you could get to net zero by 2025 is a highly political position, widely derided and at the very least debatable. The idea that you should be teaching a political position to children as though it were fact. Well, that's one step away from all those classrooms in certain parts of world history that have had portraits of the great leader in every classroom, with children learning about the revolutionary wisdom of the powers that be. And the third demand, Citizens' Assembly. So it's not clear if they now think the curriculum should be decided by Citizens' Assembly, or if they just threw it in because it's like the Trinity. You know, you can't have two without the third one. It's got to be all three. And I love what comes next in their press release. Before a similar protest in February, the Department for Education stated that there is coverage of the science and the processes involved in changing weather patterns, and they mentioned a new environmental science A-level. This is not good enough. It comes nowhere near providing students with an understanding of the realities and implications of the climate and ecological crisis. And then this quote is added. It is incredibly important. If there are only 10 lessons on climate change, that is awful, said Scarlett Posnett, 15, from Suffolk. And there's not a single lesson telling us how to address it. Our government knows the solutions and yet will not take steps to implement them. So, no, this is just a call for state education to be put at the service of political propaganda. 10 lessons on climate change seems like a reasonable number for kids to be able to understand the basic processes and what the mainstream science says. Schools are there to teach, not to wallow in the issues that campaigners think are so important. There should be sessions on it every single day between French and double PE. Schools don't teach how to address climate change because we don't agree politically on the best way to address climate change. Any more than schools teach pupils on how we should end homelessness, or how we should encourage innovation, or resolve the ongoing issue of Brexit. Much though we'd like to do all of those things, all of them are important. Opinions you have on those topics may well be valid opinions, backed by persuasive arguments, but they are not facts that are treated as education. They're propositions subject to debate and discussion. And of course, schools should absolutely be teaching children how to debate, how to frame arguments, how to evaluate positions, and to come up with solutions. They can be taught how to think. They just shouldn't be told what to think. They should be encouraged to be curious and sceptical. As Roger Scruton said, absence of curiosity is a permanent characteristic of the revolutionary consciousness. So, bad job, Extinction Rebellion, no passing grade for that work. So to finish off of this week, one thing that I like and one thing that I don't. The one thing that I like is the people's so far good-hearted and non-violent revolution in Lebanon. I was only in Beirut a few weeks ago doing some work on a video with the organisation CSR Lebanon, which may well be completely out of date before it ever gets shown, given the current events. I've had some great experiences with some of the fantastic people there, was always aware of a delicate political balance about how dissatisfied people were with what they saw of government corruption and complete inaction to benefit the lives of people in Lebanon. The top of government there's always had to be carefully set up between Christian, Shia and Sunni Muslim representatives. But increasingly in recent years, the influence of Hezbollah has been to the fore. The situation has become increasingly difficult. Now we're seeing massive demonstrations in the streets, not linked to a single faction, but a wider gathering of all sorts of people who have just had enough. How does it go from here? I watch with hope and not a little anxiety, but it has been an astonishingly positive movement so far. And the thing that I don't like, as so often, is junk research. There are articles carried by Sky News and the Guardian newspaper to the effect that a survey had shown that people felt that violence against politicians is a price worth paying in order to get their desired outcome on Brexit. Now, we live in such a divided time that almost seems plausible. Almost, but not quite. So, what do we always do when faced by such stories? We go and look at the methodology and see if it matches the stated results. What you find when you do so is either incompetent or else it's completely cynical. Here's the original question. Some have suggested that leaving the European Union might present challenges to the UK, but others disagree, labelling this as Project Fear. For each of the following, please tell us whether you think this would be a price worth paying or not worth paying for Brexit. And he then goes through a range of possible consequences, of which the very last one is this: violence directed towards members of Parliament. And you're given 3 options to choose from. Option number 1. I want this to happen regardless of Brexit, 7%. 2. I see it as a risk, but it's worth it to take back control, 39%. 3. Leaving the EU is not worth the risk of this happening, 54%. So, if you don't see that as a substantial risk, what do you tick? There isn't anything. If you really think that it's really not a risk, well, maybe there's a tiny risk. You have to choose, I see it as a risk, but it's worth it. And boom, there's your headline. You are now officially happy to see violence in order to achieve your outcome. Oh, and by the way, you might wonder what was going on with the 7%, who allegedly said that they wanted to see it happen anyway. That category was weird for all the questions. 4% of the people said that they wanted the destruction of the farming industry. 11% said they wanted the political party that they supported to break apart. 5% said they wanted themselves to get substantially poorer. I mean, that's an indicator of junk data right there. Probably we're talking protest votes at a badly designed questionnaire, or people who weren't approaching the exercise in a wholly serious spirit. Who knows? I don't believe that 5% of people want themselves to get poorer, regardless of what happens with Brexit. And I don't believe that larger numbers of people think that violence is a fine price to pay in order to get their way on Brexit. Junk data from bad research, fueling yet more bad sentiment in a divided country. Well done, Cardiff and Edinburgh University's outstanding job. That's all for this week. Thanks for being with me right to the end. My name's Mallen Baker. This is the Mallen Baker Show.